Huh? I know, you're strange though. But I went to Oregon to teach, and when I was doing a lot more traveling, my wife would make these flyers for Facebook and stuff. She spent a lot of nice time trying to promote it. And I get up to Oregon, and the guy that was up there that brought me up there, he says, okay, I got in early. He's like, we're going to go to lunch. I'm like, okay. And I don't want to be rude to people, but I've got to start being rude to people. So if you ever invite me somewhere, don't ever take me to a Chinese restaurant, a Japanese restaurant, a sushi place. Let's go to the Cracker Barrel where white people eat. But I can say that because of who we are. Right? So anyway, I get to Oregon, and the guy says, okay, we're going to go eat lunch. We're going to meet somebody that was going to come to lunch with us. I'm like, okay. I didn't say anything. The next thing I know, we pull up to this Chinese restaurant. Come to find out that the people that own the restaurant were actually believers in Yeshua and follow Torah. How that is possible, owning a Chinese restaurant where they serve cats and rats and all kind of goofy stuff, is beyond me. They didn't really serve cats or rats. That's all right. That's good. Because I made fun of it. I made fun of it then when I was there. So anyway, we have to sit in the truck and wait, right, until the other guy gets there. Finally, he shows up, and we get out. And we're walking towards the truck, and I get up to the door, and it's these old, the old restaurants have those solid glass doors where you pull open. I get up to the door, and there's this 3-foot poster of the thing that my wife made on Facebook, plastered to the door of this Chinese restaurant. I'm like, what in the world is this? Go inside, and it's on every single wall inside the Chinese restaurant is my face, along with all the information about where I was teaching at in a Chinese restaurant. Now, you are in a foreign land when my ugly mug is stuck on a Chinese restaurant up in Oregon. And trust me, if you've never been to Oregon, it's a foreign land. Especially Portland. Yes, all of those areas. Anyway, side note, I'm happy about dinner. So, our topic for this afternoon is the concept of adoption. I was all prepared to come up here and tell you how I'm going to grant you your green cards and stuff. But I found out that I guess they don't call them green cards anymore. They stopped that like 1964. Yeah, so it's like it's a resident card or something like that for when immigrants come to move here. Now, how many of you in here have been in foster care or are adopted? A couple of you. And I'm not trying to get in your business or get up in your grill or anything like that, like the kids say. But I bring that up is because my wife actually was in foster care probably from the time she was 2 to about 10 or 11 years old. And then she went back to live with her mom and dad and so on and so forth. But she went through this transitional period where she was in foster care and bounced around from one foster home to another. And those of you that have been through that kind of thing, it kind of messes you up a little bit as a kid. And if you don't deal with it, it could actually mess with you once you get into being an adult, okay? Now, this is one of the very first topics that I started studying once we got into all this ancient Near Eastern stuff. And I think it is going to hopefully bless you guys and emphasize the fact that, like we mentioned earlier, the two things that I tend to focus on is your citizenship in the kingdom and solidifying your belief in Yeshua, right? This is going to hopefully tie into both of those topics. That way, when you do run into discussions with people as far as Messianic Jewish side or even Jewish brothers and sisters, and we're hearing this all weekend already about how they don't believe that the Torah is for you, or in case you haven't heard, there's 7 other laws that are just for you if you really want to keep some sort of commandments, which are not biblical, by the way. They're biblical in principle, but they're not biblical for the Goyim to keep any type of Noahide laws or 7 laws outside. What's that? Well, there you go. Well, none of us are, really. If you are grafted in and you've entered into this covenant that we keep talking about, then you are no longer one of the nations. You are part of Israel. So, everything in the ancient world, as we just heard Brian talk about the land grant, has to do with inheritance. If there's no inheritance, then what are we really working towards or walking in? See, the ancient world, if you wanted to carry on your name and all of the stuff that you come to possess in your life, and you wanted to pass that on to somebody else, then you had to have children, right? Because that way your name's carried on. Well, in the ancient world, it wasn't always possible for people to have children all the time. So they put new things in place and new contracts in place for people to actually bring in adopted members of their family. And I think Rico mentioned earlier that the word adoption is not mentioned in Scripture. Well, it's not mentioned in the Old Testament. It is mentioned in the New Testament, but it's not in the Old. But there's elements, and the different types of elements that are attached to adoption contracts can be found all throughout the Old Testament, the Tanakh. So we're going to go through some of the fundamental terms and just kind of go over a few things we have already talked about, but I want to present these questions to you guys first. Number one, did you know that Jacob was adopted by Laban? Yes? Also, this is not on the screen or in your book, but during the whole time with Jacob and Laban, did you know that Jacob was actually in a herdsman contract with Laban? See, ancient people is when they were herdsmen, is they would enter into contracts with other people that would grant them to land to come and farm and bring their animals and do sorts of things. So he was actually in a legally binding contract with Laban. And believe it or not, those herdsman contracts, there's actually Babylonian ones you can find by researching that they've discovered, is they're set to go with the feast, or basically the calendar, the agrarian calendar, so that the contracts are released at certain times and people can be released from those binding contracts at a specific time. So Laban and Jacob were actually in a few different contracts. Did you know that Moses was adopted by Jethro? Solomon was legally adopted by Yahweh. Yeshua was legally adopted by Joseph. We know that one. And that we are all legally adopted by Yah through Yeshua. I'm going to show you some stuff in the New Testament, you guys, that literally floored me when I discovered it. Because if we don't grasp how adoption plays such a significant part in who we are as citizens of the kingdom, then we're going to have issues when we enter into those discussions with our Jewish brothers and sisters trying to say, well, hey, we have just as many rights as you do. And they don't understand the whole adoption thing, but there is hidden elements even within Judaism that it's there. And I'm going to show you some of those. Now, because we've got a lot of information to cover, we've got to move pretty quickly because Yolanda told me I'm not allowed to go over. They got to kick us out of here so they can set up for Shabbat. So I want to give you some brief definitions and some terms and some things to look at before we get into looking at Yeshua in the first century writings. Now, before I say that, is that I mentioned to you yesterday that in the honor and shame stuff that we've been learning, I'm now up to 9 elements of an honor and shame culture, and the last one that I'm just now getting into is the rhetoric of praise. And Ryan mentioned a little bit about that during his stuff yesterday. And the reason why that has become so significant, and I haven't taught this to anybody yet except for in our congregation, bits and pieces, but I'm going to be putting together a teaching just on the rhetoric of praise. And the reason for that is because in this movement, we have an issue with the New Testament being part of Scripture, right? Maybe you guys don't. But I see it often where people will say that the New Testament's really not Scripture, they're just meant to be letters and stuff like that. If you understand the rhetoric of praise in an honor and shame culture, you're going to see that the Gospels are actually legally binding documents. And I say that is because in the first century world, is that they actually had people that would go to school to learn how to praise other people, praise public figures and honor them in the Roman and Greek cultures. And they would write these documents, and they would go to these schools. This was a school that they actually went to learn how to praise somebody and write these rhetorics. Then they would read these rhetorics in public in order to get their audience to basically agree with the rhetoric in which they wrote. So they could praise that patron. They could praise that one that they were serving. They could praise that king. This is exactly what the Gospels are. Have you ever thought about that? So the Gospels have many, many different backdrops to them, and this is just an additional one that I'm learning, and I don't have all of the details to it yet, but it gives a different perspective to where we're reading the Gospels, and when I'm going to show you stuff, that there's legal language hidden within the Gospels. Well, it's not hidden. It's just not prevalently known to us because we don't study this way. But when we discover the archaeological stuff, the cultural stuff, and the language, and all the idiomatic expressions, these things come alive to us. So just to look at the Gospels, and actually Paul's letters could be basically the same thing. So the modern Western term family does not have an exact equivalent in the Tanakh, and the reason is that the two societies in question, modern Western and ancient Near Eastern have different ways of defining kinship and social identity. The Hebrew term closest to family is bet ab, literally rendered as father's house, reflecting the male-headed multi-generational household as the basic kinship until a unit in ancient Israel. A household was shaped by an endogamous marriage rights, patrilineal succession, and inheritance customs that privilege the eldest son. Basically what this is saying is that there's no real term that identifies the idea of adoption in the Hebrew language or in the Tanakh. I got a little bit ahead of myself is to tell you that there's not one in the Hebrew language. In the modern Hebrew language, there's not a term for adoption. It's because, in their eyes, if you brought somebody into your household that was not your legitimate biological son or daughter, and you adopted them, it's because it's as if you belonged to the family from the very beginning. Those of you who are adopted understand this principle. If I was to adopt somebody, adopt an additional child, I wouldn't look at that child any less than my other two, right? You're just not supposed to. They should have equal rights as a child as you adopted them because you brought them into your house. Okay? Obviously, there's no Hebrew word in the entire Tanakh for adoption. It's because whenever someone was adopted into a house or a family, it was as if they were a natural-born citizen. There was not one word in the Hebrew language for adoption until the 20th century when an Israeli lexicographers, that's a hard word, chose the word ametz, which comes from the same root as amatz, meaning strength or fortitude. Why? Because you're adding to the strength of your family's household to carry on that inheritance, to carry on that family name. You know, I joke around with both of my sons. I've been blessed to have two sons. I always wanted a daughter and that kind of stuff, but it just never happened for us. But I have two sons that they know that their name is and how they act is going to reflect not only on their lives, but it's going to reflect on my life. You know, and granted, I'm not saying I have some kind of honorable name. If you know anything about the way names are set up in Ireland or Scotland with the Mick, you know what my name means? Anybody? Son of a short man. I'll just leave that there. No, I won't, because I'm going to publicly shame my oldest son right now. So both my sons, I have one son, Eli, my 16-year-old, he's taller than me now. So well, I guess he would be the son of a short man, because now I'm shorter than he is. But then my 20-year-old is going to be 21. He's like 5'5", and he's done growing. He thinks he's still going to outgrow his brother. That's the funny thing about it. It's like, dude, you stopped growing at 18 years old. Eli's going to tower over you. So now he's going to have kids that say he's the son of a short man. But anyway, what I'm getting at is the name that you're given, you want to make sure that that name is honorable. Why? Because you are in covenant with the name above yours, right? So you want to make sure that your children and that you are carrying on that name that reflects the God in which you serve. So that's why I threaten my children with their lives, is that if you don't live the way we're raising you, I'm going to kill you. It's just the bottom line. My 20-year-old doesn't seem to think that he has to listen to us anymore, but my house, my rules. If you don't like it, you can get out. Okay, language, as far as adoption is concerned, is very similar in a lot of ancient Near Eastern contracts like we've been talking about. You see the father, vassals call their suzerain. You guys have already seen this slide once before. The son, the king calls his vassals. Adoption, when a vassal king submits to the suzerain, then the vassal kings become adopted by the suzerain. Brother for the term in parity covenants. Love, which we talked a lot about yesterday, and the word to know. These are all legal covenantal terms that you can find not only in adoption contracts, but obviously in suzerain vassal treaties and so on and so forth. These people understood that this was the language. A couple Torah portions ago, we were reading about Joseph. Actually, last week's Torah portion, where Joseph finally reveals himself to his brothers, and it says that I have become like a father to Pharaoh, but in reality, Joseph was the adopted son of Pharaoh, right? This is why Joseph actually never goes back into the land, because he is in a legally binding contract with Pharaoh. He has become Pharaoh's son, which is why, and Rico's going to talk about this tomorrow, I think, which is why when Jacob brings all of the family members down, that he adopts Ephraim and Manasseh and does the whole hand swap-a-roo deal. It's because he's bringing them into the family so the inheritance can carry on. You see? Legal terminology. Father, and this, by the way, this is also going to establish the proper way to look at the hierarchy to the kingdom. A lot of people, they want to reject Yeshua, or they want to talk about how Yeshua is the Father, or this role or that role. And hopefully after you understand this stuff this weekend, is you can see how the hierarchy is set up. Yeshua is the Son of God. Yeshua is divine, right? Yeshua is not the Father. There is a hierarchy to the kingdom, right? Does that diminish Yeshua's role? No. It just shows you the role in which that he was given. And he was given multiple roles. So we've got to understand these legal terms. Suzerain treaties and covenantal documents in the Bible. Brief summary, we've already talked about this, but the highlighted portion, if the relationship was familial or friendly, the parties are referred to as father and son. Obviously, this is legal language. It's not just saying you're calling them, hey, father, hey, pops, or anything like that. This is legal terminology showing that they are in covenant with one another. Okay, Erdman's Dictionary of the Bible. This is an excellent dictionary, excellent resource to get. And it talks about adoption and adoption formulas from these ancient contracts that they found. Which, by the way, in the Nuzi text, which is a country that was in Mesopotamia, they've actually uncovered, I can't remember how many documents, but it's like thousands of documents that they've discovered. And a lot of them have to do with adoption, which is where we're learning a lot of this information. So we're not presenting just crazy ideas to you. We're taking archaeological stuff that the Father has allowed to be unearthed within the last couple of hundred years for you and I to better understand the context of Scripture, which is where a lot of these documents for adoption is coming from, is the nation of Nuzi. So the legal transfer of a person from a family or slavery into another family, thereby improving the situation of the adopter and the adoptee. Adoption in the ancient Near East was transacted before witnesses by the adopter declaring he or she is my child, or I called him or her my child. The child may respond, you are my father or / mother. The same formulas were used to legitimize children fathered through secondary wives such as concubine or slaves. So what would happen in the ancient world is if, and we can see this with Abraham, with Abraham in the beginning, is if he's married to Sarah, right, and she's barren, what they would, and I don't want to use them completely as an example just yet, but in the ancient world, when somebody was barren and they brought in concubines, this is where Ryan was talking about the polygamous relationship, right? Is they would evidently have relations with the concubine and have a child through the concubine, and then there was a specific ritual in which they would do when the baby was born, and I'm going to go through some of those rituals here shortly. And they would actually claim that child as the father's, and the mother, actually the woman that was barren, was the legal mother of that child, even though the concubine gave birth to her, right? This is why with Abraham and Sarah you see, which mind you, they're already promised that they're going to be having a son. Granted, it's at 100 years old, or whatever the age they were. But they don't want to wait. And Sarah can't get pregnant. She says, here you go. There's my concubine. And we all know what happens with that. We end up having the Palestinians translate all the way down through that line. But they didn't wait. They didn't do what they were supposed to. They didn't trust Yahweh to just wait for it to happen. So they decided to do this exact same thing because they're worried that they're not going to carry on that lineage through their son or carry on their family name. So they took matters into their own hands, and then we know what happens there. I'm going to show you very shortly that if you look at Abraham's household in Genesis 15, is that you're going to see the perfect picture of the restoration of all of mankind just by looking at the individuals in Abraham's house. It's mind-blowing. And it shows even you and I are in that same portrait. So it's all about legitimizing, bringing in an additional person to help carry on your name and your inheritance, right? I think Brad Scott has got some teaching that he did years ago where he starts off with this goofy drawing or something. It says it's about a house and a piece of land and all that. Well, if you don't realize that it literally is attached to a piece of land, and we all want that chunk of land, and it's all based off of an inheritance. This is why you have all of the issues dealing with the firstborn and the status of who gets the most land in the family and so on and so forth, because it's all attached to inheritance. If there's no inheritance, like I said, we've got no business doing it because it's all over. We're going to end up just homeless, wandering around, not doing anything. So adoption and more adoption imagery. Most Tanakh adoptions are really legitimizations, like we see in Genesis 30, or intergenerational transferences of an inheritance. The examples closest to adoption include Pharaoh's daughter, who, motivated solely by compassion, took Moshe as her son. And also we see Mordecai, who took his orphan cousin Esther as his own daughter. Yahweh's relationship with his people is sometimes couched in adoption imagery. Abraham's election reflects adoption customs. Yahweh, Elohim of heaven, took me from my father's house, from the land of my birth. See, this is where Yahweh adopts Abraham, right? So he calls Abraham out of the land of Ur. He could have been the president of Ur, y'all. And he gave up his inheritance in the land of Ur to allow Yahweh to bring him into his family and establish that covenant with him. So now he's an adopted son of the Creator, right? To your offspring I will give this land in Genesis 24:7. Israel is my son, my firstborn, is an adoption formula including the declaration of inheritance status. Israel's redemption from Egypt is framed in adoptions from Exodus 6b through 7. I will free you from the burdens of the Egyptians and deliver you from the slavery to them, and I will take you as my people, and I will be your Elohim. Hosea 11:1 through 7 reads like an adoption repudiation contract. And I'm not going to read the rest of this because I can explain it to you this way. The book of Hosea, once you get through all of this, I want you guys to go home and reread the book of Hosea. Why? Because in the ancient world is that even though that the adopted son or daughter that I bring into my house is as if they're a natural born, if they are disobedient or they're breaking the contract of the adoption, which we're not talking about just babies here. Yes, sometimes they were adopting babies into their family, but a lot of times they're adopting adults into their family because they need them to help them work the fields and do all kinds of stuff and maybe help them get out of debt, which we'll talk about patron and client stuff more tomorrow, I think. But we're not just talking about babies who are being adopted. We're talking about adults. So if somebody breaks the contract or stipulations within the adoption contract, it was legal in many of these nations that you could not disown them. You could not disown an adopted person into your house. But what you could do is if they're disobedient, is you could send them into slavery or sell them into slavery until you deem that they have repented or they're ready to come back to the house. Does that sound like anything we're learning about here? Maybe the nation of Israel, been adopted, they broke the contract, they got kicked out of the land multiple times, they sold into slavery. So now when you look at the book of Hosea, the whole book of Hosea is showing you this whole adoption repudiation contract where Yahweh says, you guys have been disobedient. You're supposed to be the firstborn son. And we're going to talk about the difference between firstborn heirs and co-heirs and that kind of stuff. But he sends them into slavery until he says it's okay for you to come back. And this is why we're still in exile, y'all. This is why Ryan was joking around about, I don't know how he put it, but starting communes and running for the hills. And I know people that have tried to move to Israel because now they're Hebrew roots. It's my land, I'm going to move back. And guess what? They're back 3 months later. Because you won't be able to stay there. They're not going to grant you citizenship because they don't believe that you're part of it in the first place. It doesn't matter if you believe that you're part of it. The fact remains is that this is exile. So what we should be doing in exile is learning and growing and trying to walk out the commandments and do all these things with covenant and learn how to just be who we're supposed to be walking this out and not just trying to dictate when. And I know there's all sorts of formulas and crazy ideas of the exile should be over in this year, should be over this year. I don't really care. I'm still here. I've got to live here. I'm stuck in Kansas. I'm stuck in Kansas under King Joe over there, for crying out loud. All right, the Davidic king was declared Yahweh's son by adoption in a public installation ceremony, which is an enthronement ceremony, in which Yah's decree is announced, you are my son today, I have begotten you. The king responds, you are my father, my El, and the rock of my salvation in Psalm 89. As Elohim's son, he bears responsibility for the well-being of Yah's people and their land. Now keep in mind Yeshua while we're reading all these things. Elohim also appoints him firstborn of kings, in whom the commission given to the ancestors is filled, that all kings in whom that all nations be blessed in him. When this divine decree was applied to Yeshua in Mark 1 and Matthew 3, his role as Davidic Messiah was emphasized, not his adoption. Why does it say not his adoption? And we're going to go into detail with this, but I want to make mention of genealogies. How many in here love to read the genealogies in the Torah? 2 people? 3? I used to hate it. I hated it. It's funny in my house is when I'm home and we don't have Shabbat service like at HFF, because we only meet twice a month. There's no way I could do this full time at this point. Running a congregation, working a full-time job, family, that kind of stuff. So we do it every other Shabbat. Well, on the Shabbats that we're off, our family has always read Torah together as a family. Even if my sons are 20 and 16 now, they're still going to sit down, they're going to read Torah, and we're going to study it together. Whenever it comes to the Hebrew stuff and the genealogies, my wife's like, Dylan, you're reading that chapter. Dylan, you're reading that chapter. And the reason for that is because both my kids can read Hebrew, and Dylan has got a gift for, he could look at Supi Le Loomis and Haka and whoever and pronounce them perfectly. So we always give him those chapters to read. But anyway, everybody hates to read genealogies. Everybody did, or does at some point, and I did too, until I discovered why the genealogies are actually in there. Does anybody know why they're in there? Huh? It has to do with inheritance. Remember, we were talking about honor and shame. One major element of honor and shame is the ascribed honor to your family's name. This is why it's very crucial to make sure you're remembering the honor and shame concept attached to your own name. If you've got a crappy name and you've lived a life of nothing but crap, your name is just going to get trampled and trampled and trampled. Well, in Scripture, when you see the genealogies, it's specifically showing you the where the land actually belongs to, right? It's showing you the inheritance all the way back to not only Adam, but obviously through Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And then when you read about Ishmael's genealogy and all the people that we really don't like in Scripture, it's showing you legally that the land and the inheritance does not belong to this line. This is why the Torah portions, if you notice, some of them are broken up at specific genealogies. Because once they do Ishmael's, it goes immediately back into how the covenant and the land and the temple and all that stuff is connected to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So your genealogy has a very, very huge part as far as your name is concerned, because it's going to dictate your inheritance. This is why understanding Abraham's seed and the promise of the seed and the promise of the inheritance goes to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And you cannot do away with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and say, well, I'm just a believer in Messiah and I'm going to do away with this. Then you're rejecting the inheritance. Okay? So in Babylonian and Assyrian laws, contracts and letters, adoption was effected by a deed drawn up and sealed by the adoptive parents, duly sworn to and witnessed. It's a lot like what we see the structure of a suzerain vassal treaty. There's witnesses, there's all these major elements so people know that you're just not going around snatching somebody's baby and claiming it as your own. It's kind of funny, my sons are both really huge into comic book stuff, Marvel stuff, and I kind of like watching the Marvel movies, and I've got my own reasons why. If you don't watch movies, something's wrong with you. Because there's actually really good movies out there that explain things and can give you a different perspective even to Scripture. And the reason why I like the Marvel movies is because there are certain things that get you to think about scriptural things, and that's probably a whole different topic. But we were just watching the very first Superman with Eli. I was off work for, what holiday did we just have? New Year's Day or something. So we were watching the very first Superman, and you're sitting there watching it, and Superman, everybody remember the movie? Yeah, Christopher Reeves. And Superman shows up, and they send him through the pod, and it takes him like 12 years to get to the planet Earth. And he's sitting in this bucket of crystals, which some of the stuff in these movies, it makes no sense how that's even possible. So you got this baby that's flying through the universe, getting to Earth, crashes when he's like 8, 9, 10 years old, right? And then his mom and the old couple shows up. They decide they want to adopt him. They don't tell nobody. There's a spaceship that just crashes right next to them. This naked baby that's 9 years old shows up out there, and I can't remember what the mother's name was. Anybody know? Martha. Martha's like, let's just take him home and nobody will know. It's like, Come on, people. You're just going to steal this little baby from the spaceship. But they adopted him that way. But in the ancient world, you couldn't just go steal somebody's baby like that. I mean, granted, we see a lot of that stuff today. But anyway, there was legal ramifications and legal customs in which you adopted somebody into your family. So adoptions were set up as formulated, structured covenants or contracts that were legally binding. Now, I know there's a lot of information that we're trying to go through really quickly. All of this is actually in your book, so if we skip through some of it, don't get nervous. Continuing on with the adoption within Assyria and Babylon, this is what I'm trying to show you, is this is not just Israel that was doing this. You had the Assyrians that did it, the Babylonians, the Mitannis, all of these people, the Egyptians, they all had formulated ideas and contracts in which they brought people into their household to carry on their family name and pass down their inheritance. It's everywhere. So it's not just Israel doing it. And actually, once you get into the first century writings, and we're going to show you this, is that the Romans and the Romans were huge into adoption. Huge. And it's everywhere throughout their culture. So the Assyrians and Babylonians were motivated to adopt for reasons similar to those existing today. Most typically, adoption was intended to provide an heir to a childless couple who had lost the hope of producing their own children. Even though a marriage that failed to produce a male heir could be legally dissolved or a second wife could be taken for the purpose of bearing sons and of an heir, adoption of a stranger's child was a common practice. Adoption was not inspired solely by the same desire to obtain a male heir who would preserve the family name. Another common motivation was the desire of the adopted parents to have a son who would support them in their old age and perform the religious rites required upon their death. This is huge in the ancient world. You wanted to have these people that were inside your tent, so to speak. And remember, we're talking about how they lived in the ancient world. This is not, okay, I've got my house, kids, you're grown up, you're 18 years old, get out. Granted, there's times where I want my 20-year-old, I want him to get out. I really do. And most of you who are parents here, at times you feel the same way. But then most of the time I'm like, dude, you're not going no place. You cannot leave my house until I'm justified that you're properly prepared to go out and get married and be on your own. It's just the way that we feel, right? But at the same time, is that in the ancient world, is these people all live together in these big communes. This is why I think this is big in the Hebrew roots movement, as they're trying to go back to living this way. But the problem is they don't even know how to agree on this or this or this or this. They don't even know how to eat properly. And then they're trying to get together in a mountain in the land of the Ozarks or wherever and just start their own community. Granted, I understand we want to live this way, but let's learn how first before we actually just start doing things that are not proper timing. Kind of like going back to the land when we're not supposed to. So adoption of children was also common among the eunuchs of the royal palace and by the females dedicated to religious celibacy. They also looked for assurances of support in their old age. It was not an unusual practice to adopt a loyal slave to maintain and continually the continuity of care and support of the adopter in the old age. So you needed somebody to take care of you. See, today, when our parents get old, is we put them in a home. My kids joke around all the time that when me and Melanie get old, Melanie's going to live with them and they're putting me in a home. I'm like, how does this even work? We'll see. I'm going to put them in a home. That's what's going to happen. Article, New Kirkuk Documents Relating to Family Laws by E.A. Spicer. And I'm going to skip down to the middle paragraph. As summed up by Koshiger, which is another scholar, an act of adoption gives the adopted child the right to inheritance of the property of the adoptive parent or parents. This may cover either the whole or a specific part of that property. By virtue of the same act, the adopted child assumes the rights and obligations of the begotten children. So this here says that the begotten children and the adopted child have the same rights. That is not true. And I'm going to show you why that is not true. And you can actually see that in a lot of the stuff that Paul is talking about once you recognize the adoption language that he's referring to in his writings pertaining to heirs and co-heirs. And I'm going to explain that to you. It will be remembered that in Genesis 15:2, Abraham, who has no hope of any children of his own, refers to Eliezer as his heir, and further calls him one born in my house. Okay, this is where this gets interesting. So in Genesis 20 or 15:2, it talks about him telling Yahweh that Eliezer is my heir. Right? We just read it. One who is not born in my house is my heir. So to me, by reasoning of understanding this type of stuff, we've got a problem. And the reason why I say we have a problem is because if Eliezer is not a blood relative to Abraham, then how could he be the heir to his house? You ever thought about that? It's through adoption. So if we understand the language of adoption and what exactly Abraham is saying here, saying that this one who is not born in my house, which is indicating, what's the word? The one, and further calls him one born in my house. I don't know why he says one born in my house, because he's actually not born in his house. It's one who lives in his house, who was not born of his lineage, has become the heir to his house. Or I think that's when Yahweh is saying, I need to look at those verses again. But regardless, Eliezer comes into an adoption contract with Abraham at some point because they don't have any children. They don't have someone to carry on the name, to carry on the inheritance, and have an heir to pass everything on. So he's got to take matters into his own hands before he comes into covenant with Yahweh, obviously. And he brings Eliezer out of Ur with him, right? So he adopts Eliezer as his heir. A slave who had been born in slavery, presumably Abraham had adopted him in accordance with this custom for the mutual advantage of them both. But God says to the patriarch, this man shall not be your heir, in verse 4. If he had been a legally adopted heir, how could his rights be set aside as long as he fulfilled the filial duties? Here again, we find illustration in the Newsy text where it is provided that if the adopter should subsequently begot a son, the adopted son must yield to him in the place of the chief heir. So the problem arises that you have Eliezer, who's not a natural born son. He's not a natural born son to Eliezer, and I think now why it's referring to him born in the house is because he was born as a slave, but not born of Abraham, you know what I'm saying? So we've got a problem because obviously the text doesn't allude to or tell us that Eliezer broke the contract. So if Eliezer doesn't break his contract, Abraham does not have the right to do the adoption repudiation contract and send him back into slavery, right? So we've got a problem. So how did they fix this in the ancient world? Well, as we see here from the Newsy text, is it says that if you would have an adopted son first, and then you have a natural born son, then the adopted son does not lose his inheritance, right? But what happens is that he has to submit to the natural born son as the chief heir. So what does that make Eliezer? Obviously the second son, but what else? The co-heir. This is the language that Paul is using, you guys, to justify and to show you and I who exactly we are in the kingdom. And this is also going to show you, and I'm going to show you that diagram or that slide here in a minute, that shows who the natural born sons represent, who the adopted sons represent, and how Yeshua is all tied in with all of this. So, Romans 8:9. But you are not in the flesh, but the Spirit, if indeed the Spirit of Elohim dwells in you. And if anyone does not have the Spirit of Messiah, this one is not his. Not whose? Messiah's. And if Messiah is in you, the body is truly dead on account of sin, but the Spirit is life on account of righteousness. And if the Spirit of him who raised Yeshua from the dead dwells in you, he who raised Messiah from the dead shall also give life to your mortal bodies through the Spirit dwelling in you. So then, brothers, we are not debtors to the flesh to live according to the flesh, for if you live according to the flesh, you are going to die. But if by the Spirit you put to death the deeds of the body, you shall live. For as many as are led by the Spirit of God, these are the sons. See the language? Remember, Father, Son? This is adoption, legal language. These are the sons of Elohim. Who is? The ones that live according to the Spirit. For you did not receive the spirit of bondage again to fear, but you received the spirit of adoption, in whom we cry out, Abba, Father. The Spirit himself bears witness with our hearts that we are the children of God. And if children, also heirs, truly heirs of Elohim, and co-heirs with who? Whoa. If indeed we suffer with him, in order that we also be exalted together. So this shows you the very understanding of adoption in the ancient world prior to the first century, the same type of language, the same legality, how they would treat a natural born son versus an adopted son according to inheritance and heirship, and Paul is using the exact same language. You guys, Paul is the number one immigration lawyer in the first century. This is why I firmly believe, and I'm going to emphasize this on Sunday when we talk about the everlasting gospel, is that if Yeshua was walking this planet right now, if Yahweh chose to send Yeshua to us in 2017, I firmly believe, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that he would be using modern-day politics, he would be using social media, all of these things that we're familiar with in order to teach us about the kingdom. Why? Because he's doing it then. He's using everything that was the cultural norm to them in order to show them who he was, what they were doing wrong, and how to get back. Now, I'm not saying Yeshua would have a Twitter page or be on Facebook or anything, but I'm saying that he would use things that were common and normal for us. He may use a couple of hashtags, I don't know. But he would be talking about immigration, he would be talking about all sorts of stuff that we've been hearing about for the last 2 years in the election, because he's trying to get us, in our understanding, where we are in all our culture, to understand the proper ways to the kingdom. This is what's happening in the first century. This is why Paul is the number one immigration lawyer at the time, because he's dealing with a specific issue, trying to show how there's restoration for all of mankind. Is this making sense? No? Okay. Okay, here is the slide I was telling you about. This is Abraham's household as a shadow of the order in the heavenly realm for the redemption of the entire world through legal adoption language. So Abraham is a shadow and representation of the Father. Okay, we're Messianic people. We love shadow pictures. Love shadow pictures. That's when we first get into Hebrew roots or whatever, it's like that's all you ever hear about. You see the shadow picture of this, shadow picture of that. So I want you to look at this shadow, not my shadow, but the shadow picture that has to do with Abraham's actual household itself. So Isaac, who is he a shadow or a portrait of? Obviously, Yeshua. The first one is the natural born son, begotten of the Father. He's the chief heir, and he's also a shadow of Yeshua. Why is he a shadow portrait of Yeshua? Who is the only begotten son of the Father? This is basic stuff. We know that he is the only natural born son. So Eleazar, what is he a shadow of? The nations, foreigners within your gates, born into slavery, adopted by the Father, co-heir with chief heir, with submission to the chief heir. You see, this is where Israel gets into trouble, where we get into trouble. As we seem to think, and sometimes I think on the Messianic or the Judaism side, is that, granted, we as a kingdom have been given a higher status amongst the nations. I get that. But a lot of times I think we tend to forget that even though Yahweh says, you are my firstborn son, he's talking about them being the adopted son. Yeshua is the firstborn son. Yeshua has the firstborn double inheritance, right? So in the ancient world, the firstborn was given a double inheritance. You know that, right? So what would Yeshua's double inheritance be? It would be the heavenly dynasty and the earthly kingdom. That's Yeshua's double portion inheritance, which is basically everything. So we can see that they're the co-heir with the chief heir, the submission to the chief heir, and also Eleazar is a shadow of Israel, because they are the adopted son of Yahweh. So a household of Elohim, Ephesians chapter 2. Let's go there really quickly. What time am I done? 4:50. Oh, I got time. Ephesians chapter 2. Now this is where you see that Paul uses adoption language throughout a lot of his writings. And you were dead in your trespasses and sins in which you formerly walked according to the course of this world, according to the prince of the power of the air, of the spirit, and is now working in the sons of disobedience. Now, I don't know if I'm going to get time to mention a lot of this, but we're going to see how Hasatan actually is trying to have his own adopted sons throughout the earth, really. And if he's your father, this is why Yeshua says to some of the Jews in John chapter 10 that your father is the devil, because obviously they're not serving the true Father in what they're doing. Verse 4, but God, being rich in mercy because of his great love which he loved us, even when we were dead in our transgressions, made us alive together with Messiah. By grace you have been saved, and raised us up with him, and seated us with him in the heavenly places in Messiah Yeshua, so that in the ages to come he might show the surpassing riches of his grace in kindness toward us in Messiah Yeshua. For by grace you have been saved through faith, and that not of yourselves, it is the gift of Elohim, not as a result of works, so that no one may boast, for we are his workmanship, created in Messiah Yeshua for good works, which God prepared beforehand so that we could walk in them. I want to skip down a little bit. Oh, we might as well not. Therefore remember that formerly you, the Gentiles in the flesh, so he's saying formerly you, he's writing this to the Gentiles, right? So he's telling them that formerly you were Gentiles in the flesh, who are called uncircumcision by the so-called circumcision, which is performed in the flesh by human hands. Remember that you were at that time separate from Messiah, excluded from the commonwealth of Israel. Why? Because the means in which Yahweh was sending for them to be grafted in and restored back into the kingdom had not yet come until Yeshua got here. And remember, in the first century, one of the number one, maybe top 3 issues was immigration, right? They didn't allow the Gentiles to come into the kingdom unless you were first circumcised. Well, I don't even know if it was Gentiles really, but there was a huge problem with allowing the Gentiles to come into covenant. This is very, very huge in the first century. Where were we? Excluded from the commonwealth of Israel and strangers to the covenants of promise. The promise of what? Of adoption through Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the promised seed. This is referring back to the covenant originally with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But now in Messiah Yeshua, you who were formerly were far off have been brought near by the blood of Messiah, for he himself is our peace, who made both groups into one and broke down the barrier of the dividing wall by abolishing in his flesh the enmity, which is the law of commandments contained in ordinances, so that in himself he might make the two into one new man, thus establishing peace, and might reconcile them both in one body to God through the cross, by having put to death the enmity. Verse 19, so then you are no longer strangers and aliens, but you are fellow citizens with the saints, and are of God's household, having been built on the foundation of the apostles and the prophets, Messiah Yeshua himself being the cornerstone, in whom the whole building being fitted together is growing into a holy temple in the Lord, in whom you are also being built together into the dwelling of God of the Spirit. So when he talks about you being citizens of the kingdom, he's talking about this full household of God, as we've seen with the complete restoration plan through Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and those shadow pictures of Isaac and Eleazar. You follow? So whenever you run into these conversations with people, because it's going to happen, there's going to be people that are going to challenge you, not only in your belief in Yeshua, but your belief as a citizen of the kingdom. And hopefully after this week, is you're going to understand how to enter into those conversations. Granted, some of them may get heated at times, but you have to be able to present information in a way in which gets them to look at it differently. Have you considered this? This here, if I understand Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and I understand the shadow picture of Eleazar and who he was, if you just ask a Jewish person or a Messianic Jew, just ask them, how do you reconcile Eleazar? You should be able to complete this whole argument or debate, whatever, in less than 5 minutes, if you understand that Eleazar was adopted son. And his role was not diminished. Adoption of an heir. This was the most common type of adoption that was reported by reported to by a man or a couple with no hope of their own children or being adopted a son to be the heir and support them in old age in return for inheriting their estate. Now, this just goes on to talk about the importance of how it was that they needed people to take care of them in the old age. Okay. Now, the question is there evidence of the adoption language and customs in the life of Yeshua? Absolutely. But I'm going to show you how not only do we know that he was adopted legally by Joseph, but I'm going to present some information to you that he was attempted to be adopted by somebody else. It's going to hopefully give you a completely different perspective on certain chapters in the Gospels. Huh? Yeah. So Joseph's legal adoption of Yeshua. In Luke 4, it says, "And he came to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, and according to his practice, he went into the congregation on the Sabbath day and stood up to read. And the scroll of the prophet Yeshayahu was handed to him, and having unrolled the scroll, he found the place where it was written, 'The Spirit of Yahweh is upon me, because he has anointed me to bring the good news to the poor. He has sent me to heal the brokenhearted, to proclaim the release to the captives and recover the sight of the blind, to send away crushed ones with a release, to proclaim the acceptable year of Yahweh.' Having rolled up the scroll, he gave it back to the attendant and sat down." This is his way of just dropping the mic and walking off. Told you, he would use language today. "And the eyes of all the congregation were fixed upon him, and he began to say to them, 'Today this scripture has been filled in your hearing.' And all bearing witness to him, and marveled at the pleasant words that came out of his mouth. And they said, 'Is this not the son of Joseph?'" So, basically, everybody in the entire area knew he was the son of Joseph. And you can see the verses that are in your book. I go through Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John to show you how they not only attach him to being the son of Joseph, he's the son of Mary. Everybody knew that Joseph adopted him, right? Even when they have to go register for the census, they have to register all the parties. They weren't the old couple in Superman and just stole Yeshua from a pod that crashed into the ground and nobody knew who he was. They all knew who he was, and they had to basically legally adopt him so everybody did know who he was. Now, one thing I want to make mention to you is that one of the reasons why I said that even though in Judaism there's not a whole lot of terms or language for adoption, when I was first studying this is I found one resource from from a rabbi, I think from the early 1900s or 1800s, and it talked about how they had a custom and they had laws established that when a son was adopted, and you know they go through bar mitzvahs at a certain age, right? Girls go through bat mitzvahs and certain stuff like that. When they become of age and they would go through their bar mitzvah, is that the stipulation is that if that son's original biological father was still living, he was the one who had to give the blessing. If that father had died, and that gave permission to the adoptive father to give the blessing during the bar mitzvah. You follow that? Does that make sense? Okay. So, let me ask you this. Yeshua is 12 years old. Where was Yeshua at when he was 12 years old? I could just end it right there. So he's in the temple teaching people, but this is during the time in which he would have been of bar mitzvah age. And even though, and this is what I want you to see, is that his natural father was not dead. His natural father is the creator, so he's still alive. But Joseph wouldn't be the one to give him the blessing of the bar mitzvah. Now, granted, I know some of that seems like that's kind of far-fetched, but to me, I look at that, and if it actually was documented that this was a custom at some point, and I don't know how far back that it went. Rabbis go from rabbi to rabbi to rabbi to rabbi. Granted, they stop at a certain point, right? But I don't know where the custom came from, but that's enough for me to say, whoa, that's something to think about, because a lot of times we don't see those type of things. So, Mashiach is to come through the line of David. If Yeshua is not of Joseph's seed, how do we reconcile this since Joseph is of David's lineage? Through the legally binding language of adoption. That's why I was asking you, why do you guys like to study lineages? And a lot of times you go through, even the first century writings of the gospel lineages, and sometimes they're very confusing. But if you recognize that Yeshua was adopted through Joseph, and Joseph's line does come through the line of David, then he would have a legal right to the throne, right? Didn't Judas actually want him to take the throne? He did. Why would he do that if he didn't have a legal right to? Granted, this is Judas, but he's corrupt, I know. He's Jewish mafia, but he still would have understood that he had a legal right to do that. So, in the ancient world, it was that once an adoption took place, it was as if the adopted was the natural born to the adopters. Therefore, as Joseph adopts Yeshua legally, according to the customs, thank you. It as if Yeshua was Joseph's natural born and is an heir to Joseph, and in turn is to be counted to the lineage of David through Joseph. And you guys can go through and look at the genealogies if you want. Now, to make a side note, is that Yeshua is on the cross, right? And he looks over at John, and I believe that was Yeshua's brother, right? Was it, huh? No, I think the one that was, whoever was holding Mary. John. No. But he's actually transferring the authority to him, saying, behold your mother now. Because remember, Yeshua is responsible for taking care of her because he's the firstborn. He was supposed to be the one that carried on and stayed in the house to help take care of Mary as she got older. But instead, he says, here, behold your mother. Right? Never understood why he said that, even when you see it in all the movies. Why are you saying, behold your mother? She ain't your mom or whatever. But he's passing the authority on to him in order so he can make sure that she gets taken care of, because it was all about making sure you took care of the widows also, right? Right. A little bit of different things to look at when you're reading the Gospels. Matthew 3:17, the declaration by Yah to the entire world concerning whom is his son and the chief heir to the Father's house and the kingdom. So basically what happens, and we're going to read the verse here in a minute, is by this point, when we're reading this, it's believed, and I hold to this belief, is that his earthly father Joseph has died. You don't read about Joseph hardly anywhere after a certain point, and I believe that it's because in the ancient world, like we were talking about earlier, is that once you hear the voice of Yah, he's declaring to the entire world, and granted the entire world is not, it's not the big whole entire world, it's the entire world as they knew it, right? And I'm not talking about flat earth or anything like that. But it was the entire world in which they understood, the people that were within hearing could hear that Yah was declaring that Yeshua was his son. He's adopting him back into his family, so to speak, because his earthly father has passed. Make sense? I hope so. So remember from our quoted resource, adoption in ancient Assyria and Babylon. If a man, I don't know if we talked about this yet, but if a man and an infant out of his amniotic fluid for sonship has taken and has brought him up, that adopted child shall not be reclaimed. This suggests that the parents abandoned the infant and he was taken in adoption while amniotic fluid was still on him. This paragraph indicates that if the adopter was raised or has raised the infant, the adopted child could not be reclaimed by anyone, including the adoptee's natural parents, guardian, or his relatives. Context has to do with everything to authority. So what is this even talking about? All you moms all out there know about amniotic fluid, right? We as guys have no clue really about amniotic fluid. What this is talking about is that in the ancient world, one of the rituals that they would do is that you're getting ready to adopt that baby. It was a brand new baby. Is they would sometimes have the woman sit on the woman's knees, the one that couldn't give birth, and the woman who was giving birth would have birth on her knees, and the baby would come out with the amniotic fluid. There was a ritual. They would say, okay, this son is now mine, and the amniotic fluid represented the authority of the new parents. And that new authority that was granted to the parents meant that the other parents could not claim them back at some point. I really don't know the logistics of all of this, But when you look at the amniotic fluid in this ritual of adoption, Matthew chapter 3 takes on a completely different context. Matthew 3, verse 13, then Yeshua came from Galilee and Yochanan at the Jordan to be immersed by him. But John was hindering him, saying, I need to be immersed by you, and you come to me? Yeshua answering said to him, permit it now, for thus it is fitting for us to fill all righteousness. Then he permitted him. But now that I look at this, where it's talking about all righteousness, and we've talked a little bit about what actually is all righteousness. Well, if righteousness is attached to freeing the slaves, to freeing those that were in bondage and taking care of the poor and doing all of these things, and we realize that we are these outcasts and these people that are slaves to sin, that's attached to this all righteousness, right? And it's linked to us being adopted back into the family. So Matthew 3:16, and having been immersed, Yeshua went up immediately from the water, and see, the heavens were open, and he saw the Spirit of God descending like a dove and coming upon him, and see a voice out of the heavens saying, what? Yeshua is coming up out of the water with the water still on him, just like the babies with the amniotic fluid. And Yahweh is saying, this is my son, making the declaration, so everybody knows that, hey, you may not believe it, but I'm telling you, this is my son in whom I'm well pleased. And that way nobody can deny it. You ever seen that before? Some of you have. A little bit of a different perspective to show you that some of these verses in the Gospels, they are to show you legality to covenant. Legality to all these different contracts that everybody would have understood in the first century and beyond that. Now, it's what's going to get interesting is how we're going to read chapter 4 here in a minute. Back to Erdman's dictionary. The legal transfer of a person from a family or slavery into another family, thereby improving the situation of the adopter and the adoptee. What kind of improvement did Yeshua just get? I mean, he's given the double portion of the inheritance right there. So his situation actually improves, and also he moves up in a higher status to the kingdom because Yahweh says, this is my son. There's no higher position than that, except for Yahweh himself, right? Adoption in the ancient Near East was transacted before witnesses. There was witnesses there. Remember, everything in the ancient world is done in public, especially if you're trying to honor somebody or you're trying to shame somebody. John is immersing people out in the public. This is why the Pharisees were coming and asking him if he was the chosen one or any of these other type of things, asking him who he was, because he's out there doing this in the open, honoring these people that are being immersed back into the kingdom. All of this stuff that happens within the framework of adoption you can see throughout the gospel. So at the end of Matthew chapter 3, we have Yeshua, the Messiah, coming up out of the water from being immersed, water representing the amniotic fluid as mentioned in the prior reference. As he comes out of the water, and the Father is declaring who his heir and son is to the entire world, in turn stripping the authority over the earth from Hasatan and giving it to Yeshua, the chief heir to the Father's house. Now, you may remember is that there was multiple, what time do I go to? 4:15. Okay, I got about 20 minutes. In the ancient world, or not ancient world, but in the first century during the temple period, is they had miraculous signs that would happen on Yom Kippur, right? Anybody heard this before? There was multiple miraculous signs that would happen to let them know whether or not that the Yom Kippur sacrifice was accepted. One of the major ones they did was the one of the crimson wool, right? They would tie a piece of wool right at the top of the doors of the temple. They would let the scapegoat go. They'd do the offering. They'd apply the blood to the altars. And if Yahweh says, okay, yes, you've been forgiven, what happened? Turned white. Well, after Yeshua died in 30 of the Common Era, for 40 years beyond that point, that never happened again. And why did that happen? Why did that not happen? Because they rejected the heir to the house. So you're given this shadow picture of the earthly temple, right? They're given a covenant and a way in which they should be living, which they didn't do. They neglected to conduct acts of justice and righteousness, especially in the first century. Granted, it was before that too. But then the Messiah shows up. Yahweh declares that this is my son to the entire land, that he's the Messiah, and they reject him. They said, nope, we have more honor than he does. Because they were not willing to submit to the authority of the king in which they claimed that they were serving. So when they reject the heir to the house, you reject the dynasty. And what happened 40 years later? The temple was destroyed. They're sacked by Rome, sent into exile. Adoption repudiation contract all over again. Because you rejected the heir to the house. This is why people do not understand when they decide that they're going to learn a little bit of Hebrew and they're going to learn a little bit of rabbinical studies, that they're going to decide to question who Yeshua is. And then they ultimately get to the point to where they reject who he is. Because they don't investigate every single angle before you make a stupid decision. And they're stupid decisions if you really think so. They really are. This is why you heard Rico say, if you reject Yeshua, you can't be my friend. You're cut off with me. That's just the way that it should be that way for everybody. It's one thing if they don't already know who he is. You understand what I'm saying? But if you come to know who he is and then you decide after a little bit of study that it's not for you, I don't want anything to do with you. This is very, very critical information that we need to understand. Moshe Weinfeld's back. The covenant of grant in the Old Testament and the ancient Near East. The phrase, I will be his father and he shall be my son, is an adoption formula and actually serves as the judicial basis for the gift of the eternal dynasty. This comes to the fore in Psalm 2 where we read, he said to me, you are my son, this day I have begotten you. Ask me and I will give you the nations for your patrimony and the ends of the earth for your possession. Ends of the earth, we could get a flat earth deal out of that. Sorry, I've been waiting to say something about that for 2 days now. Similarly, we read in Psalm 89, I have found David my servant, in whom my hand shall be established. My arm shall hold him. I will smash his adversaries before him and will defeat his enemies. He will call me, you are my father, my God, and I will make him as my firstborn. This is directly talking about Yeshua. The highest of the earthly kings, I will keep my grace forever, and my covenant shall endure for him. Shall his children forsake my law and will not follow my decrees? I will punish their rebellion with the rod and their sin with afflictions. Notice he doesn't say, I'm going to disown them. And he says that he's not going to disown them because of why? Because he made an oath to Abraham. So he's got to fulfill that oath in some manner, some way, somehow. And if he's already established Israel as his firstborn adopted son, he's got to carry it out somehow. So what he's doing, he's basically weeding us out. And that's what's going to happen personally, I believe, when the tribulation does actually start. I don't know if you agree with that, but the reason why you read the Torah portions year after year after year is so you can see how it's going to play out again. And I'm sorry, there's going to be Cortes, there's going to be all sorts of scoffers, there's going to be all sorts of Balaams, there's going to be all sorts of stuff. And I'm sorry, my tent is going to be in the back of the camp because I don't want to be around any of those people. Because there's going to be a purging then, just like there was during the first Exodus. Would you agree with that? We don't know all the details, but something to consider. Okay, what follows this event of Yeshua's immersion and authority given to him by the Father is the immediate leading of Yeshua into the wilderness, right? So you see Yeshua comes up out of the water in Matthew chapter 3, and what happens next? He's led into the wilderness to be tempted by Hasatan, right? Okay, this is extremely important. The elements of adoption, its language and its context, is the backdrop behind the scenes of Hasatan's attempted temptations and an attempted adoption of Yeshua. Now, we saw this slide earlier from Rico, and it was actually Ryan who brought it up the first time. But it showed you how Shalmaneser's bowing down, or Yehu's bowing down to Shalmaneser, basically bringing him gifts. He's saying, okay, I reject the authority of Yahweh. I want to become your adopted son, Shalmaneser. Why? Why would you want to do that? I have no idea. But what he's doing here, this is to show you a portrait that this is actually how things were done in the ancient world. So as soon as he rejects the authority of Yahweh as his father, because the king, remember, the king of Israel is the son. Yahweh is the father. They're supposed to serve him and serve him only. Granted, yes, he would send nations to conquer Israel, but why did they send nations to conquer Israel? Or what? For disobedience, to push them back into repentance. Yehu says, okay, I want to serve the king of Shalmaneser because I'm terrified or whatever reason. I'm going to bring him gifts. I'm going to pay the tribute to him and not to God. And I'm basically going to become the son of Shalmaneser. And this is what happens. This is why we show you this picture. To give you that portrait, that covenantal language, the Father, the Son, the adopter, and the adoptee. Okay? Now, go to Matthew chapter 4, verse 1, please. Matthew 4, verse 1 says, Then Yeshua was led up by the Spirit in the wilderness to be tried by the devil. That's what this version says. I don't know what multiple versions are saying. So this is basically, Yeshua is trying to bring, or not Yeshua, Hasatan is trying to bring a covenantal lawsuit against Yeshua at this point. That seems really smart, right? No. And after having fasted 40 days and 40 nights, he was hungry. And then the trier came and said to him, If you are the Son of God, command that these stones become bread. Now notice the phrasing here. If you are the Son of God, he's asking him. So if you're the Son of God, command these stones to become bread. So he's tempting him, right? He's trying to get him to accept the temptation. And I'm going to show you what would happen if Yeshua would have given in to any of these temptations. But he answering said, It has been written, Man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of Yahweh. And where's that verse found? In Deuteronomy verse 8:3. Notice that all three temptations that are going to occur here, Yeshua uses which document? No. Deuteronomy, which is what? After all you've learned just in 2 days, what is the book of Deuteronomy? It is a reinstitution of the original suzerain vassal treaty between Israel and Yahweh. I don't know if we've even explained this yet, but why did they have to have the book of Deuteronomy if they've already got the Torah? If they already knew what the commandments were, why did they have to have a new version? Because it was a new generation, but also, it was because Moshe, who was their king, in a sense, he was the vassal king leader, basically, he was about to die. So he's got to gather the new generation together that is getting ready to head into the land, and he's got to pass the authority on to Joshua. This is why whenever a king on his deathbed in any kingdom, is they would gather the people, pass on the heirship to the next person, and they reinstituted the covenant with the people for the new king. That way they all got together, they all knew that, okay, just because there's a new king, it's a little bit different when you have Obama and Trump and all these people that are coming in, they change laws like left and right, and like they change their underwear. It's not the same. Yeah, maybe they should have changed them, yeah. But he's using this book because it is the last issuance of the treaty, so to speak, in which Israel was already supposed to be living by, and they agreed to. And if Yeshua is understanding all of that stuff, he's going to use this document to prove that, look, I'm not going to go against the dynasty of the Creator. I'm not going to go against his earthly kingdom, because if he does, then he's disqualifying himself. It does. Right. Yes. Verse 5. Then the devil took him up to the set-apart city, set him on the edge of the set-apart place, and said to him, If you are the son of Elohim. Believe it or not, when I studied this the first time, I did not recognize that he asked him 3 times. Is it 3 times? if he was the Son of God. Even though I understand what exactly is happening here, I never saw that until just now. That he's actually using that very phrase, if you are the Son of God. Hasatan knew who he was, knows who he is. I never saw that before. He's using the same exact language. And he said to him, if you are the Son of God, throw yourself down, for it has been written, he shall command his messengers concerning you, and in their hands they shall bear you up, so that you do not dash your foot against a stone. Yeshua said to him, it has been written, you shall not try Yahweh your Elohim. So you see, even though he's got the position, he has the high status as the Son, he's not taking the authority or the honor away from Yahweh, correct? If he does, what is he doing? He's disqualifying himself. Yeshua knows exactly what he's saying and what he's doing here. He's not just rambling off scripture verses. Hey, this is my life verse, Hasatan. I mean, seriously, think about it. He knows exactly what he's doing. I'm sorry, that's funny. I get a kick out of the whole life verse thing. Life verse. The whole book should be your life verse. Verse 8. Again, the devil took him up on a very high mountain. Oh, this is interesting. Side note, why the high mountain? In the ancient world, this would have been known as a cosmic mountain. Anybody know what a cosmic mountain is? Few of you. Cosmic mountain. In the ancient world, every single ancient Near Eastern nation had what they understood to have their own cosmic geography, which meant that the gods lived here, the creation was here, and there were certain elements attached to all of the creation, right? The cosmic mountain was where the gods would meet with the people. Even Israel believed that there was a cosmic mountain. You can see cosmic mountains all throughout Scripture. Mount Sinai, the Mount of Olives, the place where the Transfiguration was. And this is actually would have been considered a cosmic mountain because you have Yeshua, who is a representation of the covenant, who is battling right now in a game of wits. This is a challenge and riposte right here. Right? Hasatan is challenging the authority of Yeshua as what? As being the firstborn son of Elohim. So they're doing this on what is known as the cosmic mountain, would have been the intersecting point. Every time you see these cosmic mountains, it's an intersecting point of heaven and earth. This is why the Temple Mount is so crucial. You start speaking against the Temple Mount where Yahweh put his name, you're saying that that cosmic mountain doesn't exist. And there's not a connection between the people and the Creator. Just by looking at geography, but we don't understand that kind of stuff. So they're on top. He takes them on top of this high mountain, which probably would have been close to where the temple would have been. Showed him all the reigns of the world and their esteem. And said to him, all these I shall give you if you fall down and worship me. Remember our picture. Then Yeshua said to him, go, Satan, for it has been written, you shall worship Yahweh your God, and him alone shall you serve. So then the devil left him, and see, messengers came and attended him. So the three attempts of Hasatan, they failed. We know that. But what would have happened if Yeshua would have gave in to any one of these? Think about it. Have you ever thought about this? Hasatan was legally trying to adopt the Messiah of the universe. Have you ever seen this before? No? This is nuts. This is why we don't understand the whole schemes of the devil, really, if you think about it, because you don't understand ancient context of what things were done in the way that they were. So, literally, if Yeshua would have bowed down to Hasatan in any one of those, this is what would have happened. Yeshua would have denied the grant of the kingdom by the Father. Because Yahweh declared, now granted, mind you, if you're an adopted son, you could reject anything you want and take off. But you're going to end up serving somebody else, correct? Those of you who are adopted, if you did not like your adopted parents, you could have probably ran off eventually, found some new people to live with, or when you were 18 years old, you just said, okay, I'm done with you people. So in reality, in the ancient world, you could have done the same thing. Just like King Yehu there was given every promise that he could have possibly wanted just by serving the king. But he says, I don't want this. I don't want this kingdom anymore. I'm going to go serve Shalmaneser. I don't know what Shalmaneser had on him. But he chose to reject all of the blessings of the kingdom to fall under authority of another. So number one, Yeshua would have denied the grant of the kingdom by the Father. Number two, therefore submitting to the authority of Hasatan. Number three, authority on the earth going back to Hasatan. Think about that. Remember, as soon as he comes up out of the water, the amniotic fluid represented the authority of the kingdom, of the dynasty. Yahweh says, this is my son, and he transfers that authority to Yeshua at that time. All right? So if Yeshua would have bowed down to any of those things and served Hasatan, then he basically is handing the authority of the kingdom back to the enemy. Number four, Yeshua becoming the adopted son / vassal to Hasatan if rejecting his father's authority. Therefore, he eliminates his position as the Messiah. And the son and the heir to the dynasty, the heavenly kingdom. But we know that this plan was unsuccessful, right? So Yeshua, obviously, we read the verses. He ends up using the exact treaty and covenant that he's supposed to be using to point the authority back to the Father and not himself. Therefore, he still maintains a position of being Messiah, which in turn transfers to you and I. Well, what are you talking about? Well, remember, we were all outsiders. We were all outside the kingdom, right? There had to be some sort of restoration plan that the Creator put in place so we could become part of that promise, that oath that he gave to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And he's done that through the work of Yeshua by allowing him to complete his work, therefore granting us the ability that we just read in Ephesians chapter 2 and in Romans 8, and all the language that Paul is using with being heirs and co-heirs, to now have our inheritance. You now have an inheritance back. So if you reject the heir to the house, Yeshua, what kind of inheritance do you think you're going to receive? Does this make sense? The language of adoption is huge, especially as you're going to go through, like I said, these conversations eventually with people. You need to be able to show them the legality to how you are a citizen of the kingdom, and they cannot take that from you. This is why I will not step foot in certain congregations. This is one of my pet peeves that I always seem to get fired up about and I talk about a lot. It's not that I don't love certain people. It's just I'm sick and tired of people telling me I don't matter and I'm a second-class citizen and I don't have the same rights as you do. Otherwise, everything that I've been doing as far as trying to walk a scriptural walk with the Messiah is for nothing. It really is. So now when you go home and you talk to your Christian family members and your Christian brothers and sisters, you ask them, what are you living for? They think they're going to be floating on a cloud with a violin, for crying out loud. When you die, you're not going to heaven. Right? Where are you going to live? You're not living on a cloud. So they'd have no idea what the context of anything it is that they believe because they have not been taught. So go home and you show them, hey, this is how you are a citizen. You have an inheritance. You're not living for nothing. I don't understand that whole mindset. I really don't. So now this gives you a different perspective to now how you can justify your own citizenship. You don't need a green card. You've got this book that says that you are a citizen of the kingdom. Amen? Amen. Thanks, guys.